So will you all please now join me in welcoming Al Gore to give the first annual Paul R. Epstein Memorial Lecture.
Thank you so much, and way overly generous to me, but I want to focus on the beautiful eulogy for Paul. It was so warm and accurate and wonderful, and it's an emotional event for me and for so many here who had the privilege of working with Paul. I want to acknowledge, first of all, Andy Epstein, and Paul's daughter, Jessie, and her and Andy's sister, Joanne. And, there's no protocol in doing a double introduction for you, Jessie, but your dad would be so happy and so proud. And let me also acknowledge the staff members and people who had the joy and privilege of working so closely with Paul. I know that you two have suffered a painful loss and have reveled in the qualities that Eric so ably captured in his description of Paul. I want to acknowledge President Drew Faust, our minister, Jonathan Walton, Dean Julio Frank, Professor Jack Spengler, and again, Eric Chivian, who I had the privilege to work together with very closely at the same time that I worked with Paul. And I'm very happy that Jim McCarthy is going to be coming up after my prepared remarks here to moderate the Q&A. The three of them, along with others, have been so important to me. And I was thinking as Eric was talking about the number of times, late at night often, I would call up Paul and tell him I need to fix this slide. What happens to the range of mosquitoes in the 2-degree increased world? What's the altitudinal range increase? And what evidence is there that higher temperatures stimulates more reproductive cycles in a season? And those and other questions he often knew the answer to off the top of his head. But when he didn't, he would invariably just set aside what he was doing and dig in and get back to me. And the movie that I made about this and the book that y'all were kind enough to make reference to would have been very different without Paul Epstein, I guarantee you. And a lot of things would have been different without Paul. He was a hero to me and a passionate champion. What some people call a connector. He brought people together, and he was a dear personal friend and always so responsible. So when I received the invitation to speak at this event, I immediately felt the honor of it and have been looking forward to it. Let me say a word about Harvard's commitment to the environment, because one of my previous visits here with President Faust was to launch or to witness the launching of the Harvard Office of Sustainability. And when I walked out, look at the crowd, it it was as big a crowd as there is at commencement, really and truly. And all the banners saying green is the new crimson. And now some time has passed, and we see extremely impressive results, and not least the incredible activism and engagement by students who have contributed to the progress the university has been making. I'm not going to talk about the new book that I've launched this week. I'm going to talk about the issue that Paul enlightened me and so many on. I'm going to talk about Paul, and I'm going to talk about the context within which his work on health and global warming took place. And any discussion of this topic poses a challenge to all of us, because we have to hold on to hope. At the same time, we look, as Eric said, unblinkingly at the sun. The dangers we face are almost unimaginably dire. And even saying that much can paralyze people. Any such discussions need to be entered into with an awareness of the time budget, the complexity budget, and the hope budget. I'm filled with hope. And I don't think it's a Pollyannish hope. I'm pretty sure it's not. My hope is based on the history of our experience as a species in arriving at certain junctures at which it is very clear, increasingly clear, that big changes are necessary. And as often as not, when the stakes have been raised and the chips are down, we have found a way to rise above our limitations. And this is, in one way of describing it, a problem of consciousness, a call for us to expand our awareness of who we are and our relationship to this precious and unique planetary home. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also worried, and that's a healthy attitude. I've told some here about a story that captures some of that contradictory feeling. I asked someone, how do you feel about the progress we're making on the healing the global environment? And he said, well, I feel fine. And it reminded me of a story that I first heard 35 years ago in Tennessee, when it was told by a comedian named Cousin Minnie Pearl from the stage of the Grand Ole Opry on the longest running live radio show in history. And I almost drove off the road. I was driving back to my home, to my farm on a Saturday evening after having town hall meetings. And Cousin Minnie Pearl told about a farmer who was involved in an accident. And considerable damage was done to his vehicle, and he hired a lawyer and went to court to sue for damages of the driver of the other vehicle. And the lawyer representing this other driver cross-examined the farmer and demanded to know, isn't it true that immediately after this accident you said, I feel fine? And the farmer said, well, it's not that simple. You see, I was driving my cow to town in the back of my truck, and this man came driving across the center of the highway, and the lawyer said, I object, Your Honor. We're in the middle of a trial here. We don't want to hear a long, involved story. Just answer the question, yes or no. Did you or did you not say after the accident this man came driving across the center line and ran right smack down into my truck and knocked it over. Threw me out, threw the cow out. I was on one side, the cow was on the other. The highway patrolman came up and took one look at that cow and said, "Oh, she is suffering." Pulled out his gun and shot her right between the eyes. He came around to my side of the truck and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel fine." And in a very real way, that's kind of the alternative that we face in finding the causes of optimism and hope that are indeed very real. The Harvard Center for Global Environmental Health has become a fantastic international leader in its field because of Paul and because of Eric and the others who have made it so. For almost 2 decades, this center has helped to broaden the discourse about the relationship between health and global warming. Paul would often tell the story of how cholera was discovered in the late 19th century. John Snow, one of the fathers of modern epidemiology, discovered that by overlaying the confirmed cases on a map of London, he could trace its origin to a single pump on Broad Street. 3 decades later, Louis Pasteur realized that bacteria was the cause of cholera, and shortly thereafter, the society responded by building purification plants and creating much better safeguards to protect the public's health. And of course, Paul's point was that today we find ourselves in a very similar situation. The dots connect very powerfully. And the examples of the warming climate's influence on the proliferation of diseases threatening humans are quite compelling. And Paul wrote about many of them. Dengue fever spread around continents by mosquitoes now afflicts up to 100 million people each year. It causes thousands of fatalities and is often known as breakbone fever because of the extreme joint pain. Tracing dengue fever to the carrier and then tracing the extended range of the carrier to warmer temperatures and also to increased extreme weather events, both floods and drought, is something that Paul taught a lot of people. A team of Indian scientists recently noted that because insects are cold-blooded, and I quote, "temperature is probably the single most important environmental factor influencing insect behavior, distribution, development, survival, and reproduction. It has been estimated," continuing the quotation, "that with a 2 °C temperature increase, insects might experience 1 to as many as 5 additional life cycles per season." We can look on the maps made by experts who study animals and plants and see the expanding and the range and the movement to different microclimates and to different latitudes. If you take birds, you can lay it out very clearly. If you look at the plants, spring's coming about a week earlier, and winter's coming about a week later. Sometimes the trees are getting confused and will blossom in December and January. We've all seen examples of that. But even though we can see the large animals and plants, we have to understand, as Paul taught, that the microbes are affected the same way. They change their range. And, of course, the microbial communities with which we share our body minds outnumber human cells by a factor of 10. And the new research into the microbiome is yielding great insights and the emergence of a new paradigm. According to a study in Science magazine not long ago by Andrew Dobson and others, global warming is now causing the spread of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that cause human diseases into areas that were formerly hostile to them. Quote, climate change is disrupting natural ecosystems in a way that is making life better for infectious diseases, according to Dr. Dobson. Quote, the accumulation of evidence has us extremely worried. Another author of the study said, and I quote, we're alarmed because in reviewing the research on a variety of different organisms, we are seeing strikingly similar patterns of increases in disease spread or incidence with climate warming. The Union of Concerned Scientists pointed out that extreme weather events like heavy rainfall and droughts often trigger disease outbreaks, especially in poorer regions where treatment and prevention measures may be inadequate. Mosquitoes in particular, continuing to quote, are highly sensitive to temperature. Now, we need improvements in public health, and we need to understand that international air travel has also contributed to some of the phenomena, and the factors need to be teased out. But everything that I've read you about these recent findings was anticipated by Paul Epstein. He wrote seminal papers 12 years ago, and although the evidence required more careful and wise interpretation when there were fewer dots to connect, he saw the pattern very clearly, and he was right. And he inspired those in his profession to follow his footsteps. And so we all have a great debt to him. I'm optimistic today also because in his inspiring inaugural address, President Obama made the climate crisis the very first challenge he discussed and spent more words on it than any other. I welcomed that. I was thrilled by that. It was the kind of commitment that requires significant follow-through. I remember when I was a young boy in Carthage, Tennessee in the summers, about 6 years old, I saw the bigger boys jump off the high diving board, and boy, I wanted to do that. But I was scared. And one of the ways I finally worked up my courage to do it is I climbed that incredibly high ladder and walked out to the end of the board and looked down and then looked at the people on the side of the pool. And I had to jump. I had no choice. I think he's got no choice. And I think he welcomes the challenge, having talked with him. And knowing, as I do, from working in the White House for 8 years, how difficult this challenge is, I believe we're going to see inspiring action. The context within which Paul's wisdom played out, warnings were issued, lessons were taught. It took 200,000 years from the birth of the human species in roughly our modern form to reach a population of 1 billion. We've added that many in the first 13 years of this 21st century. And we'll add that many more in the next 13 years. And that many more yet again in the 14 years following. And although the stabilization of population is a success story unfolding in slow motion, it nevertheless forms one of the pillars of the new reality that we must look at unblinkingly. We've quadrupled population in less than 100 years. Our impact is much more than it ever has been. And Earth Inc., the interconnected global economy that is growing so rapidly, now relies upon carbon-based fuels for 85% of all the energy that is burned. 154 years ago, not that long ago, first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania. And oil joined coal as the primary source of fuel for the second industrial revolution. And now the combustion of those fuels results in the spewing, the only word I think fits, the spewing of 90 million tons of global warming pollution every day into the atmosphere as if it is an open sewer. When Paul told the story about cholera and the history of John Snow in the late 19th century, sewers played a key role. And at some point in the development of cities, a new consciousness arose, and people noticed that the shallow trenches in the middle of the street were becoming more difficult to live with more people. And somebody said, hey, we should use our streets as open sewers. And luckily, in most parts of the world, they decided to change that. Now we're using, as I've said, the atmosphere as an open sewer. And it's functionally insane. It traps heat. And as Jim Hansen mentioned earlier, and his colleagues have pointed out after doing careful calculations, the laws of physics do apply, and these heat-trapping pollutants do trap heat, and the aggregate amount of heat trapped now by man-made global warming pollution each day is equal to the energy released by 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs going off every day. It's a big planet, but that's a lot of energy. And it is causing radical changes in the context of our relationship to diseases. Radical changes in the implications of where we choose to live. Radical changes in the design of our communities in the future. It's causing much more evaporation of water off the oceans and leading to much more convection energy that makes the winds off the ocean and those storms that come on shore much stronger. And the warmer air holds a lot more water vapor. Take a hot shower in the morning, the mirror might steam up. If you take a cold shower, it won't. We've got 4% more water vapor than we did just 30 years ago in the atmosphere above the oceans. And understand, please, as the scientists have pointed out to me, that the rain and the snow doesn't originate just from the part of the sky directly above where it falls. It comes from these large basins in the sky that reach out frequently 2,000 kilometers with the water vapor funneled inward to to the point where the downpour occurs. If you've got a bathtub full of water, pull the drain, the water rushing down the drain doesn't come just from the part of the tub directly above the drain, it comes from the whole tub. And when you have 4% more water vapor in a 2,000 kilometer basin of water vapor that's funneled inland and released, then you get bigger floods and bigger downpours. 3 days ago in Queensland, in Australia, they had a downpour that dropped 2.5 feet of rain in 48 hours. Just shy of that, 27.5 inches. 2 years ago in my home community of Nashville, Tennessee, thousands of my neighbors lost their homes and businesses in a giant flood and had no flood insurance because it never flooded in those areas. It was what they described as a once in a 1,000-year rainfall. Well, there are a lot of communities around the world now that are experiencing once in a 100-year events, once in 500-year events, even once in a 1,000-year events every few years. Because we are radically changing our relationship to this ecosystem. And of course, the same extra heat dries out the soil moisture even more powerfully than it evaporates the moisture off the